Our guest speaker for the first session this evening is Hillel Levin.
Thanks, Rich. I'm the bit of counter-programming because I have written extensively on that other side of John DeLorean. Did anybody see Myth and Mogul on Netflix? So a few people have seen that. And that kind of more extensively went into some of the things I wrote about. I guess my claim to fame or infamy for some people here is I wrote the first extensive critical article about John DeLorean that appeared in a city magazine in Detroit that opened up for the first time in the United States questions about GPD. But what I did is I looked at his business practices after he left General Motors, which no one really was familiar with. And I don't think if the British government had really focused on these businesses, they would have ever given him the money they did. And a big figure, by the way, for those here earlier in a lot of these businesses that went so bad was Roy Ness. So I'm going to make this interactive. I mean, the other claim to fame I have, or infamy, is at a certain point after DeLorean was arrested, literally no one, virtually no one in the United States had ever written a negative thing about him. And kind of overnight, I was on the Today Show and Nightline and all of that, and had a book contract with Viking. And shortly before I finished the Viking book, which is called Grand Delusions, and it's available if anybody wants to, I'm going to sell it in the library afterwards and tomorrow morning. But shortly before I finished that book, I was arrested in the Detroit Metro Airport with an envelope that contained cocaine. And if you see the Myth and Mogul Netflix, Christina talks about John DeLorean, who developed this kind of hatred for me and fear about what I was going to write. He said to her, wouldn't it be great if Hillel Levin was caught with cocaine? And in various depositions, she's mentioned not Roy Nesseth, but some private investigators he was working with who did that. And it's kind of elaborate how it happened. Fortunately, it was done in a heavy-handed way, so ultimately they dropped the charges in 10 days, but which didn't mean those 10 days weren't very difficult and expensive for me. I can talk about that if people have questions. I can talk about GPD, which was what that trial that nobody paid attention to in Detroit was about. And that was about him taking money from the company in a deal that he was cooked up maybe with Chapman from Lotus. He was acquitted in that trial. He had an excellent lawyer. It was the way they picked the jury. I don't know if people are aware of it. It was like the prequel for OJ. A lot of the techniques they did in jury selection were things that they used in the OJ trial. And Howard Weitzman was OJ's first request as his defense counsel. And he, I think, wisely turned it down, but he was an excellent lawyer who ended up with a Palma estate that DeLorean had in payment. So, but something I just thought I would touch on briefly, if you're interested, because this is about DeLorean, but maybe you're not, is I see a lot of similarities with Elon Musk. And maybe someone has already talked about that here or not, but could I talk about that for 5 or 6 minutes? And I want to say, for whatever negative I have to say about John DeLorean, I want to say there's a lot positive. He was brilliant in marketing. He had significant impact on GM and their product and understanding the youth market in the 60s. I think the design of, obviously, of the DMC vehicle is iconic. I mean, you can say this is an icon of our time. I mean, I grant all of that. But I think he had a business model that he was unable to execute, but Musk has executed. And one of the producers of the Myth and Mogul documentary said to me, when they approached Musk, he said, "I want no association with John DeLorean." I don't know if that's gotten out or people have heard that from other sources. But building a company around a sexy two-seat sports car was a brilliant idea. And of course, it was the success of the Corvette and the inside knowledge that DeLorean had that was not tapping, it didn't begin to tap the sports car market. And, you know, Musk has gone on, and I'm going to say a few critical things about him perhaps, but it is amazing what he has done. And in the auto world, I think the only comparable person I can think of is Henry Ford. And there are some interesting similarities in those two people. But Ford was even that much greater in changing civilization in America. And I grant SpaceX is big, and I don't PayPal, but I think the Starlink is a huge innovation. This is a real big thinker. In terms of what he does in the auto industry, I think where we see this immediate tremendous success, I think there's a question. The things that I find similar in the personalities of the two men is, you know, they do have this expansive imagination. And obviously Musk has capitalized on it, not with Twitter, but certainly SpaceX, certainly with Starlink, which I think is a huge, you know, which is the internet, the satellite internet system. I think, you know, this is somebody who really takes things to another level that other people would be afraid to get involved with. What is not so known about DeLorean is he had this similar, one of these executives said to me, he's always chasing these balloons. He's like never stopping. We need him to focus on this financing, or we need him to focus on building the plant in Dunmurry. And he's talking about buses. So that was one of the things, that he was going to build a new kind of bus. And he was also going to take over European or distribute European utility vehicles. He was going to be involved in the acquisition of American Motors. That came very, very close. I mean, it was like literally a handshake away from not happening, because at the last minute he asked for more money. And a guy named Alfred Bloomingdale, I don't know if anybody from the Bloomingdale family was ready to put that all together, and overnight, obviously, the stock would have gone from $1 to $5 or $10 if DeLorean had been the CEO. And he had a tendency to renegotiate at the last minute. And he was in with a group of people with the AMC deal who basically said, this is the deal. We're not going to change it. Deal is off. And they all left that project. But he had that ability to look for all kinds of different things, but he definitely did not have the focus to get the company over the hump that Musk did. And where I think the two men are very similar is some of that was this contempt DeLorean had for marketing and for the market research. So J.D. Power said to him, if you take the price of this car up to a certain level, you're going to sell 5,000. You're going to sell 15,000. If you take it up to this other level, you're going to sell 10,000. If you take it up to where ultimately the $26,000 price, you're going to sell 5,000. They were dead on. They told him, and C.R. Brown told him, this is really what the market is going to give you at this point in time. And DeLorean was, but my name, the glamour, the car, the stainless steel, all these other things are going to take me to all these other levels. And they didn't. And that is, in essence, if people say, why did that company go bankrupt the way it did? It was overcapacity. And the overcapacity was also driven by the fact he's getting a royalty as part of the deal with the British government. They wanted to employ as many people as they could, and they were going to encourage him in every way to get every car possible off the assembly line. So it wasn't just greed on his part, but some of it was greed. He wanted to do an IPO. He wanted to do what Musk did. And, and that's why Musk is one of the, if not the richest man, and he did that IPO. And that was another of the distractions that some of the executives would say is that was a major obsession of having a stock market push. And it's actually the prospectus for that opened up to me this company called GPD that this 14 million was given to. Now, where do I see Musk going wrong? Right now, I mean, a line that they used in one of the documentaries that I said was things got really bad for DeLorean when the cars started to pile up like plague rats on the dock. And right now, the inventory is expanding dramatically for Musk. He may have the right product, it's not the right time. And unlike GM or any major car company, he's cutting prices right and left because he has built this huge capacity, especially in China now, to get these cars off the assembly line. And that spiral can be a death spiral. I mean, look, I'm not investing or wanting to give anyone advice. I just think, to me, there's something very eerie about this and about what you're reading now about the inventory growing. So I think there's that kind of similarity, and I think from everything we can see about Musk's personality, he's not necessarily listening to marketing advice. I mean, obviously he hasn't done it with Twitter or X or whatever you want to call that. I mean, what's interesting to me, like the little tidbit here is, Henry Ford was someone, I think, in a very similar place as Musk with the Model T. It just hit this popularity. I mean, he wasn't on the stock market, but he was obviously the wealthiest man in the world at the height of their business. But he had a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent that went to every owner of a Ford. And that paper was his Twitter. I mean, he had all these extreme ideas about things he really didn't know much about. Tried to keep America out of World War I and then out of World War II. If anybody knows what the Christian identity movement is, very extreme right group, that was his PR guy started that. Not just in America, but the world. And Hitler said, the man I most admire is Henry Ford, not the man I most admire in Germany, but the man I most admire. And now we're hearing, echoes of some of that with Musk. So I think that egotism builds this concept that now I've made all this money, I can change the world and everything. Even though I was so right on these couple things, I'm now going to be right on everything. And that can ultimately be dangerous, but it can really hurt your brand. And I think the affection that Ford had for Hitler and the fact he got the German cross from Hitler, shortly before we went to war with Germany, really hurt the brand for a number of years with a segment of Americans. So, all this stuff is part of when you try and become that figure. Now, the difference between John DeLorean and Henry Ford and Elon Musk is he actually was a very well-read individual and somebody who had a lot of time to read, but who really read, was very knowledgeable across a wide range of subjects in a way that, Musk clearly is not, and a way that Henry Ford clearly was not. I mean, in many ways, Henry Ford, when he went on the stand for a lawsuit, just came off as so ignorant, he settled the suit very quickly. John DeLorean was in no way like that. He was an extremely polished individual when you talked to him, and he had this ability to read what you wanted to hear very effectively. And I think that, obviously, you call it charisma, but I think, one-to-one or in small groups, it was very effective. And at times it went overboard because he would promise things and sales figures that, in fact, he couldn't deliver on, and that people who understood, the issues around IPOs, you can't overpromise, you've got to be very careful about everything you say, it would drive them crazy. But that was this inbred salesperson inside John DeLorean. I mean, he was always selling and always trying to win over any individual he met. So before I just ramble on and blather on, any questions about anything I've said or any concerns?
Yeah, what lawsuit are you referring to with Henry Ford?
It was a lawsuit where he claimed a Jewish lawyer was taking over agriculture. And it was a series of articles that went in the Dearborn Independent. And after his few days of testimony, he was so embarrassed, he actually staged an accident, saying someone tried to run him off the road. And when he was in the hospital, Harry Bennett, are you familiar with Harry Bennett?
Yeah, the service department.
Harry Bennett was Ford's bodyguard, the head of his private security force, who came this close to taking over the Ford Motor Company. And the government literally told Henry II, get out of the Navy, come back. They installed an FBI agent to watch over him. And because of the vote of his mother and his grandmother, he ended up in control. Otherwise, Harry Bennett would have ended up in control. But Harry Bennett then went to the equivalent of the Jewish Anti-Defamation League and worked out a settlement. So Ford didn't have to go back and testify. I don't know if that's more than you wanted to hear or not, but so, these are these personalities that kind of hover over the history of Detroit. And I mean, what's so unique about DeLorean was he wasn't just the sales guy, and he was that rare GM guy who the dealers loved. But he was an engineer guy. So you have, the Billy Durant is the crazy stock guy who built GM by acquiring more and more brands, but who didn't know anything about cars other than what they looked like. And then you had Henry Ford, the engineer, who I'll give you any color as long as it's black. And if he had been left to his own devices, would have made the Model T until he drove the business into the ground. And that was his son Edsel, who said, "Dad, you can't do that. You got to do a Model A." And then he convinced him to buy Lincoln, and he really saved that business. So, but DeLorean, it was that unusual combination of the two. And I think that sales quality is something the number crunches to this day. I think the only person remotely equivalent was Lee Iacocca. Because Lee Iacocca was a great engineer guy, great engineering person, who knew how to do a lot with a little, but was obviously a great salesman. I mean, for those, I look at some of the faces here, you may not even know the name. A lot of us older people do. John.
Thanks again for coming. My question has to do with the GPD situation, but
Yeah.
also with DeLorean's relationship with Chapman, and I'm still, I think Zach, you are too, but I'm still trying to wrap my brain around all of that. I mean, I see DeLorean constantly racing to try to meet these deadlines. And to go from a farm field, you can build a factory and take a prototype into production. My take of it, and I'm kind of curious as to what your thoughts are on this, is that I think he was realizing that the way that it was set up with Bill Collins, they just weren't going to get there, and that Chapman was very much somebody who promised him that he could get him to that finish line, and ultimately they did. But GPD, is that a DeLorean Chapman concoction? Is it a Chapman concoction? Could you kind of give us a little
I think
summary?
it's a Chapman vehicle. Something he had probably done before. A very slippery guy is what I was told quite a bit. And again, a lot of major manufacturers and celebrities in England focus all the time on getting their money out of the country so they don't pay taxes. And he had a number of things going. In terms of how I stumbled on it, in those days, his annual reports were actually not in Delaware, but in Lansing, Michigan, the state capital of Michigan. And you couldn't just go on the phone or the internet, you had to actually drive to Lansing. And I saw that there was something called the DeLorean Manufacturing Company. Okay, so DMC, DeLorean Motor Company, and it was DeLorean Manufacturing Company. And then I could get these annual reports that listed other places of business. And that's what opened the door to me to all these other failing businesses that he started after he left General Motors. And when I looked at the revenue for those annual reports, they went from one year, I forget what year it was exactly, it went from $200,000 to $14 million. And this was this business that you didn't even know what they did. And suddenly it goes from 200,000 to 14 million. And then I see this prospectus, and I see in the prospectus this amount has been paid to GPD. This is a problem with the GPD payment, that it created this phantom army of engineers that did not exist. That was what that money was being spent for. He had already gone to Lotus, as you said, John. He was already using those guys. So what was this phantom army of engineers that GPD was paying for? What were they going to do? I mean, one of the bizarre things about that car when it came off the line is it really never had the complete parts manual that manufactured cars tend to have. I mean, the sorts of things that this company, according to not just Bill Collins, but people from Lotus said to me, they should have had done. And that was a lot of the difficulty in getting the car off the assembly line. And that was a lot of reason for some of the incredible warranty issues that followed, once the car was released. And the reason they had to kind of practically reassemble things in Irvine. So it was in many ways like the primal sin of his ownership of that company. And it led to a lot of breakdowns that followed from it. And why did he do it? I don't think there was any reason he did it that was for the good of the company. I think he had gone to a lifestyle, he was trying to maintain that lifestyle at a very high level. And again, it was another thing you can see. There were some excellent people in that company, in the motor company, especially Bill Stryker, the CFO, who had just a great record at other companies. And he said to me, every time I tried to challenge John, he would say, what are you nickel and diming me for, quote unquote. So, those are the things that were percolating underneath. And, like John and I discussed earlier, there were not a lot of sources of revenue in those days. The whole venture capital thing was really just getting off the ground. And he was kind of a progenitor of that with the Wood Gundy deal was kind of a unique thing that was, one of the early prototype deals was a limited offering. It wasn't a stock market offering. But, it broke paths there. But still, there was not the money to support that and to get him over that hump that was going to occur, for any new auto company. But it was even more compounded by, the other issues he faced with just the market here wasn't quite ready for cars being sold at that volume.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
Going back to the Musk comparison with John and obviously with Henry Ford as well, something that I've always thought about with Elon Musk was that there was something there related to the government incentives that were being offered for the car. I mean, huge tax breaks and incentives to get these cars. I don't think he would have had the success that he had without getting those government incentives. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily. Look, bottom line in Northern Ireland, I don't know if Nick is still here, but that plant was a great thing for that area. And by the way, it maintained its existence beyond the DeLorean Motor Company. I don't know to this day if it's still making, car parts and things. But it really did bring the community together in a lot of ways. It's just a shame that on his way out, John had to blame the IRA for sending him out of Northern Ireland. I mean, that's where the ego really took over and did some nasty things as a result of it. But that was the deal. That's why he got such a good deal in Northern Ireland. It was a totally intractable situation, really unimaginable. I mean, it's like building a car company between now Ukraine and Russia. It was that bad for younger people. You had the Protestant neighborhood on one side, you had the Catholic neighborhood on the other. They had to enter through different ways. They had, if anyone has seen the movie Hunger about the Tommy Sands hunger strike, that was happening in the midst of all of this, as Nick will talk to you about. So it's just incredible that they built it and that it produced cars. I mean, it was a great accomplishment. But there were issues with those cars. And that money that was given to GPD was better spent on more engineering help. What did he do with that money? Okay, the annual reports told me he ends up buying a company that makes giant snow grooming machines in Ogden, Utah. And it was actually a military vehicle with the idea that if they could take the top off of certain mountains located in Alaska, they'd see the Russian missiles going over Sarah Palin's house a little sooner. But, you know, it was actually a decent business. And he screwed with it a little, but not a lot. And that's where that money went, instead of for engineers to help actually build a real good parts manual. Yes?
So based on your analysis, do you have a sense for how much money would have actually been spent on engineering resources to actually take a car that was a concept and make it a production vehicle? Just the reason I'm asking that is, I work in engineering for the past 30 years.
Yep.
When I come up with a concept, it's a very small time frame. I could develop one prototype in 2 weeks. It costs $10,000, but when the production parts come out, it takes typically one of my products I'm designing within 2 months.
Yeah.
It takes a year and a half to develop it. It's a fast producer. So the sense of what I think the audience is getting from you is that they're hiding money, when in fact, there's a lot more in implementation. So
No, I'm not saying they're hiding money. They took the money. They took it. I just told you where it went. I told you it went to the company, it was called DeLorean Manufacturing, and that's where it went. And then that money went to buy the company in Utah. I'm not saying they hid it. And I think, to your point, there were two systems to build those parts, the resin parts. And that system where he came in, it was kind of like a resin sandwich, where he devoted a lot of time and money to produce it.
You talk about the vacuum assisted resin injection.
Exactly.
Very, right.
And they couldn't do it on a production.
Correct. Right.
And at that point, he felt the better part of valor in meeting these deadlines was basically working with Lotus. And the car that was produced was in very many ways a Lotus car. And that was some of the way around that issue. It just meant that the car had two shells. It had the Lotus shell, and then it had the stainless steel shell. And that's what made it so heavy. And again, that created other issues in terms of fuel efficiency. And it was not the fuel efficient car he promised.
As a curiosity, you say heavy, but I would suggest that 3,000 pounds is very light for you in that time. I don't agree that it's heavy.
He promised a car, I mean, again,
How are the weight ratio items?
but if you read On a Clear Day, he goes, I'm sure you've read it. Look at how he complains about the car that came out of Lordstown because it was 100 pounds heavier. His car was many times heavier. And because you're so knowledgeable, you know every little thing makes a big impact. So being a few more 100 pounds heavy than what you said is a big difference. So the car was not, I mean, we can look at it, I can talk to you later, I'm not just making things up off the top of my head. But yeah, I mean, that, again, there was a lot of over-promising and not necessarily delivering. But, you know, we could talk a lot too about Tesla and their warranty issues and how that car is made, but Tesla drivers love it. And obviously the DMC drivers love their cars. And, you know, some of these things don't necessarily relate to, you know, there's love that goes into it, maybe more than anything else, but yes. Yep. Yep.
Nice to meet you. Thanks for coming. So throughout my life, I've tried to, there's the business guy, and then there's, my father, and to me, they're two totally different people. So I know you've done some digging. I've heard you say some good things about what my father's done and things like that. And I know you've done extensive research into his business ethics and, maybe morals and things like that. I'm just kind of curious and you can say whatever you want, you're not going to offend me, but what, after all these years, after, the thing with the locker and GPD and everything, what, like you personally, not necessarily maybe as the writer, what's your assessment of him, like as a human being, like from God to Hitler, where you know what I mean? I don't know if I'm wording the question right to you, but I'm just kind of curious as to what's your take on, like what you think of him, like personally as a human being, as a man or a human, and not just the automotive guy from GM and DeLorean.
I think that there's a lot that I saw that showed he could be a sensitive human being. And he had talked to me about you losing a watch, getting mugged in Central Park somewhere. I don't know if you remember that, I'm sure you do. And then someone else had said to me, a vendor who was having incredible problems with him, that I was just ready to, go to the lawyers and the police and trying to figure out who first. And then I saw him walking with his daughter and said, I don't know, maybe I'll go and call him again and see if I can work this out. There were two sides to this man. One side was Roy Nesseth. Roy Nesseth was a bad guy. I'm sorry to say that to you. I mean, I appreciate I love the depth you showed, and some of that doesn't surprise me. I even know Roy was deaf in one ear. There was a lawyer in San Diego who specialized on prosecuting Roy Nesseth, suing Roy Nesseth. That was his specialty. People came from all over the country. Roy was your father's legal flapjack. So when a business went bad, Roy would become the CEO, and he'd be the guy to go to court, he'd be the guy they sue, and he could be, I could tell you, very crazy, raunchy stories about Roy. And that was one orbit of John DeLorean. Then there was this other orbit of John DeLorean. There were people like Collins and his CFOs and his secretaries and assistants who are wonderful, really organized and really capable people. C.R. Brown was this, whatever you guys may think of him, this guy was just unbelievable the way he worked on getting those cars ready after they first came over. So you have these two orbits to him. And again, as I said, I met him, I've spent several hours with him at one point. And then when I was going to write an article about him, he called me up and said, why are you doing this to me? What did I ever do to you? And I said, look, I went and looked into these things, and just tell me your response to GPD, your response to this failed company, your response to that failed, your response to this rancher in Idaho, this farmer in Idaho who lost everything getting in a twisted deal with Roy, trying to buy that ranch your father had with his second wife, or bought with his second wife. So those were the two sides of it. And I'm sure you saw the one side. and I'm sorry to have to say this to you, because, I find what you say very moving, and I certainly felt you made a real valuable contribution to framing John DeLorean. And look, the thing I find with all these celebrities that I've ever had to write about, especially in the business world, like Musk, right? They want that celebrity. And your father was that way. I mean, it's a drug. It's a drug. There are some of them that really don't want any part of it. But he wanted it. He wanted the image. He was very much about the image. But with that celebrity comes attention. And with that attention comes the other side of that sword blade. And he hated me intensely for writing those articles. And in fact, went on the radio in Detroit after that article came out and said, I attempted to bribe him and not publish it, which could have ruined my career. The only thing is I had on tape him saying to me, come to New York, and I'll let you know about this conspiracy, and, that was non-existent. I said, John, this article is still coming out. And then he was like, forget it. And then, he made that accusation. I had to threaten to sue him. Talk about man bites dog. And then he withdrew and wrote me a letter of apology. But then, he sent me up to go to prison for a number of years. If I had been arrested, if they hadn't been so heavy-handed with the way they did it. And yet, I really endeavored in that book to show, the best side of him. By the way, he was a jitterbug champion in college. You never saw him dance, but that was a whole part of his early life when he's being a cool guy, cool and hip before the war, so. Thank you for your questions, by the way, and for listening to me. Yes, hi.
What got you initially interested in writing about him? What was it, and how deep did you think you had to go? Did you want to go, and why?
I was going to do an extremely positive story for him when I was at New York Magazine, and scheduled several interviews. And this was when the car was just going to come off the line in Northern Ireland around that time. So it would have been like 80, 79, 80. And Bill Haddad, who he was convinced was, the guy who was, feeding me all the bad information, is somebody I knew through other articles I'd written at New York Magazine. So Bill arranged those initial interviews with me. And then I wrote this glowing story about how this guy was going to show GM, and Bill gave me a copy of On a Clear Day, and I read all of that. And then I moved to Detroit, and one of these executives called me, not Bill. Because if anybody was despised in that office next to John, it was probably Bill. But very honorable guy from with a good pedigree at GM, and said, "You've got to look at this prospectus." And then I saw, all these things he said to me. He's kind of violating. This is a quick buck. This is going for all these achievements we're not ready for. I mean, just the stuff that's right there on a clear day.
You're talking about Bill Haddad here?
Bill Haddad. No, Bill Haddad didn't send me the prospectus. It was someone else.
Oh.
But Bill arranged that original interview I did with him in New York. And that's when I went and got those annual reports. And, what is this GPD, and why are they giving them $14 million? And, what are these other businesses? But it was those annual reports. That was how I found out about the ranch in Idaho, That's how I found out about the dealership in Oklahoma City. That's how I found out about Roy Nessif. All of it came out of leads I got off of that annual report. And the rancher, I said, you know, what is he doing in Idaho? Like on Route 20 or whatever it was. And I just lucked into some city clerk saying, oh, is that auto guy from Detroit? And I said, yeah. And she said, you know, you should find out what he did to Clark Hillel or something like that. He's in Idaho Falls. There would be no way if she hadn't told me that. I would have known it was Clark Hillel. I would have known it was Idaho Falls. So all these things fell together. And, you know, again, I don't know if am I at the limit or... So, I mean, one of the fascinating stories that came out of that, when you talk about the man's genius, he had the rights and the ability for the most important aftermarket engineering device of the last half of the 20th century. What was that? This little thing that costs a few cents that goes on the radiator and prevents your radiator from overheating. I don't know about the rest of you. We all grew up seeing cars on the side of the road with the hoods up and the radiators boiling over. And this is an amazing story of this self-educated truck driver inventor who was trying to fix his mother-in-law's car. It was always, the radiator was always bursting and the pipes were bursting. And he figured out there are too many bubbles. And if I could just put this little thing in here and eliminate the bubbles. And the Lordstown plant was actually ripping off that patent, and the guy had a patent. And DeLorean knew about it. They had an aluminum engine car that was constantly overheating. And he showed up, and you know, this guy really didn't know how to get a big business going because you need to have major manufacturing if the part only costs a few cents. And immediately DeLorean caved to GM, settled for $200,000. And, you know, this guy thought he was going to make a lot more money than that. And then somehow the casts were broken and stolen. Roy Nessif shows up. And here's a classic Roy Nessif story. This inventor is in the hotel room with 3 lawyers, you know, wondering if he needs to break from DeLorean. And Nessif is 2 hours late. So Pete says to him when he walks in, you know, I have these lawyers here. Do you know what this is costing me an hour? And Nessif says, you know, I got a gal spread eagle back in the hotel. Do you know what that's costing me an hour? That's Roy Nessif in a nutshell. And he becomes the CEO of this company. And of course, everything fritters away in the lawsuits where Pete is trying to take the company back. He's getting threats over the phone, according to his wife. Eventually, he had to pay something like $400,000 to get it back. He finally gets someone who knows what they're doing. They negotiate with just a few of the Japanese companies. They settled for $45 million. So can you imagine what he could have gotten out of GM? He was not a great businessman. I'm sorry. He had other strengths. GM was a perfect place for this guy. But when it came to that, I mean, how could he have blown that? In my opinion. So, I mean, that's just emblematic of the things I found. And it's like, how are you going to give this guy $200 million to build a plant in Northern Ireland?
So I have a question about the GPU.
Yes.
Real quick, last question.
Thank you. So I live in an area that gets lots of snow, and we have DeLorean snowheads.
Yes, that's it.
They still are out there?
Yes.
The business is still
Yes.
going, right? So that was presumably a good investment.
Yes. That was his best that I ever came across. From ill-gotten gains. He bought it from Thiokol, which is I don't know if you guys, anybody here worked for them. It's like a company down in Chicago.
Are we mixing up GPD and Logan Manufacturing?
Yeah, the GPD money is what paid for Logan Manufacturing to buy the snowcat. So, okay.
Okay, thanks,
Well,
Hillel.
thank
Hillel
you.
will be in the DCS museum with some of his books, and we'll also be able to answer any of the questions that you have not been able to ask.